Hey folks, Knox at IT Inspired here. In the last few videos when we were diving into Azure, we were mostly talking about the Azure Platform as a Service offerings and functionalities, that being the hosted web apps and the hosted SQL servers, but we haven't touched too much on infrastructure as a service, being virtual machines. Those are the things that we as sysadmins are a lot more comfortable with, right? We know about hardware virtualization and how to build that out. So today I wanted to dive into that with something called Unifi. You may be familiar with Unifi or Ubiquiti's line of products called the Unifi Networks. Unifi is, like I just said, they're manufactured by Ubiquiti. They're very cost effective, and they have a very robust set of offerings. And I absolutely am a huge fan of it. But Azure doesn't offer the Unifi app service where you can just spin up a Unifi controller pre-built out and ready to go. You kind of have to build it out in a virtual machine on your own. And that's what I wanted to walk you through today. So let's get started with it. We can dive right in. What you want to do a little bit of prep work, once you log into portal.azure.com, if you haven't used the Cloud Shell yet, you'll want to launch it right up here in the top right next to the little bell. There's a little shell icon. When you click it, the first time it launches for you, it's probably going to tell you need to create a storage account so that the shell can persist in memory or persist commands and things that you've done over time. So just go through that little wizard to create a storage account for your shell. It's very straightforward. It's extremely cheap. You don't have to worry about the cost too much. And make sure that you can get the shell up and running. The second thing is I believe the shell defaults to launching in PowerShell, so you'll want to switch it to Bash. That's going to be very, very important for a couple of commands later. So you'll switch it to Bash, and once you've switched it to Bash, it stays there. So we just want to make sure you've got the ability to launch this shell for when we get into it. Okay? Great. All right, so we're going to create a virtual machine, and we're going to create a Unifi controller using Ubuntu Linux. Ubuntu Linux is super lightweight. It's, of course, free, so it's going to cut down on your monthly costs. All in all, to run this Unifi controller for a small business or a home, you're probably looking at around $10 a month. Of course, all those prices are subject to change, but it's really not too bad, okay? All right, what do you say we just dive in and get started? All right, so you can see I've already got a Unifi controller. We're not going to be messing with that. We're just going to create a new virtual machine from scratch. So to get started, you're obviously going to click on Virtual Machines at the left-hand side, and then click Add. Now, it's asking you what kind of virtual machines do you want to create. Obviously, you can see they've got a lot of VMs that have services and software pre-installed on them. Very, very cool, but of course, we're here because they don't have a Unifi offering. So we're just going to choose the canonical Ubuntu server, and we're going to use the 16.04 long-term servicing channel image, and just go ahead and click Create. All right, so the basic things that it's going to ask you to configure, the basic ones, you're going to go ahead and name this VM whatever you want to name it. I'm going to call mine Unifi 2 since I already have a Unifi. We're going to have to give it a username to log in, and this is the part where I was talking about where you want to have that Cloud Shell. So since we're working with Linux, I highly recommend getting comfortable with using the SSH public keys. It's just so much, it's very secure, and it's so much simpler to manage and maintain once you've got it going. So let me show you what the process is to go through that. To get a public key, you're going to launch your Cloud Shell, and you're going to type SSH-keygen, all one word, and you're going to press Enter. Now, it's going to prompt you with 2 or 3 questions along the way. Just accept the defaults. Basically, just press Enter, and that will generate a key for you in just a second or two. Now, it won't spit out the output of the key. What you're going to have to type to actually get the key itself, once you've generated that, type cat space dot SSH / ID underscore RSA dot pub. That is actually going to return to you your public key. It's going to be a very, very long string. It's going to start with SSH-RSA, and it's going to end with something that you might, if you look closely, it might look sort of like an email, maybe like the username that you typed in here at something, then followed by some weird string. Copy the whole thing. Copy the whole thing out to a notepad or someplace where you may want to maintain it manually, or if you don't want to maintain it manually, if you don't want to have that record sitting around, it's always right here. You can access it at any time in the future by launching the Cloud Shell and typing this cat.ssh/idrsa pub command, and it will spit out the output. Now, I'm not going to, because I use this key for my production stuff, so I'm not going to share that with the world, but you go ahead and copy that output onto a notepad, or where you really want to copy that output is directly into the SSH public key field. Now, I'm going to paste it in because I know it's going to be so big that you won't be able to see the whole thing. So I'm just going to click paste. There we go. Very good. Okay. So that's what it's going to look like. I'm going to close this, and see, when I kind of closed it, it gave me a little green check mark, so it knows that key is good. We're ready to go. Don't worry about Azure Active Directory right now. You know, that's obviously we're using a Linux machine, and I'm not worried about domain joining it. We're not ready to tackle that much of a headache right now, right? Okay. Subscription, we've already got that set up. A resource group. If you want this to be isolated in its own resource group, feel free to do that. I'm going to go ahead and do that and create a resource group called Unifi 2. Now, the location, this does have an impact on your pricing. I have found that East US tends to be a little bit cheaper than, Central US. But maybe if you're interested in scaling, if you're very interested in or availability sets and availability zones, which is a fancy way of saying different ways to keep this VM highly available, you might want to look into East US 2 or Central US, because they are a little bit more flexible, even though East US is plenty fine. I'm just going to choose East US, keep this as cheap as possible for right now. You know, it's not a super critical VM since we're just doing it for a lab purpose. And I'm going to hit OK. And it likes everything. We got a nice check mark. Now, size. This is a fancy way of saying price. So the size of the VM here, you can see you've got so many options, and there's really no limit to the amount of money you can spend, right? That's the way they want it, after all. The cheapest one is the B1S. Anytime you see S, that's a fancy way of saying it can use premium storage, or SSDs, which you saw we had selected in the previous screen, maybe, if you were observant. B1S is perfectly fine for a small business or a home VM to run a Unifi controller with 1 CPU and 1 gig of RAM. All right, so if you've just got a handful of devices, and maybe 30 to 50 clients connected to those devices in your network, you'll be perfectly fine with the B1S. So I'm going to choose the B1S. You're looking at roughly $8 a month in the East US there, $8.04. Not bad at all. And you're maybe thinking, well, you said 10 or so bucks a month later. Well, yeah, you do have to pay for the public IP space, and you do have to pay for outbound network and just a tiny fraction for any additional storage that you may use. So I said safely it's probably going to be about $10 a month. Okay, cool. B1S. Let's go forward. Okay, settings. All right, now we're getting into the good stuff. So let's take a look. We're not too worried about setting up the availability set right now. If you were interested in scaling this VM horizontally, availability sets may be more interesting for you. Basically, that's a way of saying that while the Azure data center may go down for either a fault or an upgrade maintenance, when you spin up new VMs, it will separate these VMs into different fault domains and update domains, meaning Azure plans for this domain to go down for maintenance, so the other update domain will stay up. I hope that makes sense. It's very tough to explain it without a whiteboard. We always want to use managed disks. Just keep that in mind. We shouldn't even have to go over this. I'm just telling you, use managed disks. It provides redundancy and fault tolerance, as the little dialog there says. OS disk default of 30 gigs will be perfectly fine. Now, all right, so now we're ready to move on to the networking portion. Let's talk about this a little bit. So the way this works is first you declare what your supernet is going to be. Or the other way to put it is, if you're familiar with studying for the 70-741, the networking Windows Server 2016. They call this the address block in IPAM. So you would declare what your block is going to be, and when you start this out, the default may actually be 10.0.0/24. I've already tinkered with it a little bit, but you're going to see 10.0.0/24 and then a subnet of 10.0.0/24. That's kind of restrictive, actually. What you want to do is you want to plan this to where the whole network that you may want to use in the future is going to have a name, and then you're going to say, what is my block? What is the IP addresses that I am later going to subnet be? So in this case, I said, let's start with the block of 172.16.00/16. And then I'm going to later subnet that 172.16 block, which I do literally on the very next line. In fact, let's call this subnet my inside LAN. And that subnet will be 172.16.1/24. So you can see I've taken the 172.16 and I've subnetted it down to 172.16.1. So that is what my unit. So we're creating the network, and then we're creating the subnet, and this is the subnet that I'm planning for my Unifi controller to connect to. If you don't know subnetting, just kind of follow along with what I'm doing. If you do know subnetting and you want to plan your network differently or accordingly, maybe you plan on putting a site-to-site in place later, this is where you can do that. And of course, you can add or change networks or subnets at any time. That is very easy to do in the virtual network section right over here on the left. So let me just click OK and let it create that VNet. All right, let's go down here. And you can see it's already automatically assigned the subnet here for me. All right, public IP address. Well, obviously, this controller is hosted in the cloud. We're going to want my Unifi controller to be accessible publicly so that the devices in my house or my business can reach the cloud. So let's check out this public IP here that we've got. Okay. And this looks perfectly fine. You don't have to worry about dynamic or static too much. I mean, obviously static is probably what you're going to prefer here. But if you choose dynamic, it only occasionally changes after reboots. I have rebooted my Unifi controller several times with a dynamic IP and have not changed the IP address. It did change after the very first reboot, and then after that it has stayed the same even though it's been dynamic. So you can opt for static or dynamic, just do whatever you want to here. The basic SKU here versus standard SKU, this is essentially comes into play if you are going to be dealing with availability zones, meaning that you chose East US earlier, right? Well, in East US, there are actually more than one Azure data center. So when you choose standard, that makes this public IP address in the East US available across all Azure data centers. Why is that important? Network load balancing. So now you could load balance across the data centers by assigning the public IP address to a load balancer that is also standard and can span across the different data centers in that region. Very cool. Again, I'm not too worried about that right now because we've just got one VM. We're not really dealing with availability sets, so we can just proceed with the defaults here and just click OK. Now the network security group, this is going to be your firewall rules essentially. So you can see we've got the allow SSH rule that's already created. That's what we're going to need. I'm also going to add two more rules. And this is going to be important for the Unifi controller. The Unifi controller communicates over 8080. That is when devices need to communicate to it. And of course the adoption process. So you can see the source is set to any. And the destination is perfectly fine as any because we're only going to have one device in this subnet right now. If you were going to have more than one device, you could specify the VNet or the IP address and create a network security group just for that device. But since we're dealing with a brand new VNet with only one device, this Unifi VM in it, I'm perfectly fine with leaving 8080 here. In fact, we're going to leave the name port 8082. That makes perfect sense to me. Great. Now the other one that we need is 8443. That is what we actually browse to get to Unifi. whether you're using the Unifi app or the web browser. So we've got port 8080 and 8443 added to our firewall. Let's click OK. Awesome. Everything else here is looking pretty good to me. I'm not too worried about Azure AD. I'm not too worried about paying for backups right now. I mean, this is just a lab. Don't really care about boot diagnostics or OS diagnostics. Definitely don't want to set my device to auto shut down. I want this Unifi controller to be up all the time. Let's click OK. We got errors. Of course, I missed a very, very important thing here, and that is the priority of my port rules here on that network security group. It's telling me right up here front. But what an important detail for me to just overlook. Let's go back here, and let's get back to that network security group, and let's tweak 8443 and just say priority 101. That's, oh, I gotta hit OK to that, don't I? Set 8080 to priority 102. Okay, so I set the priority to 102. You have to click off of it to get the little green check mark and then click save. Let's go back to 8443. Let's set this to something like 103, just something we know is going to be different, and click save. Let's check on what SSH is. That priority was 1000, so we're not too concerned about that. Now let's hit OK and hit OK. Validation passed. We are ready to create our VM. All right, perfect. And you can see it's going to cost us about 1 cent an hour. I mean, that is just such fantastic. All right, let's click create. And we are just going to wait a few minutes for this deployment to take place. I'm going to pause it and we'll come right back. And just like that, our VM is up and running. It takes you straight into the resource group. The first time this thing launches, you may be tempted to just get right into it. Give it a minute or two. The VM is still going through a boot up process. So give it just 1 or 2 minutes once you see this screen come up before you actually try and connect to it. Now, we haven't even talked about how to connect to it. Let's talk about that. Right here in the top left of this little box here, you can see it says connect. When you click on that, it doesn't actually connect you. It just shows you how to connect. So you see this log in using VM local account right here. This is what you want to copy. And this little button right here, click to copy, that's what you want to click. So we're going to copy that, and it says copied. We can close it. Let's bring up our shell again. Remember this old guy. And it's going to request a shell, and we're going to paste. Now this is where that SSH key that you generated before, this is where you're going to see how awesome that is. You're going to press enter, and when you press enter, it's probably going to prompt you to accept the certificate. Just type in the word yes and press enter again. Now I've already done that, but you're going to press enter to this. It's going to prompt you to accept the certificate. Type in the word yes, press enter again, and you will be on the command line of that machine. Just like that. So now you can see the command prompt change to Nox at Unifi 2. That's how you know we are on this machine. We're ready to start configuring our Unifi controller. And you're about to see how easy that is. It's just a couple commands, and I have this website pulled up. I'm going to put this at the bottom of the video or in the comments so that you can get here and just copy and paste them. Because that's what we're going to do. We're not going to hand type all this, right? We're just going to copy and paste the whole thing so that we can get that going. All right, cool. On our Ubuntu machine, I've copied it. I'm going to right click and I'm going to click paste. I'm going to press enter. And just like that, it doesn't throw any errors. It seems pretty happy with that. Very cool. The next thing we're going to do, we're going to use method A. Download and install the following trusted key. Cool. We're going to copy that. And I'm going to paste. Press enter. Seems to like it. All good there. Let's go to the third command and let's say update all of our stuff. Make sure we've got the latest repositories that we can download from. I'm going to press enter there. This may take just a second to get through all of this. I might pause it. Yeah, I'm going to pause it. And just like that, we're done. And the very last one, let's go ahead and install the Unifi controller. Now, it's going to ask you, do you want to continue? Yes, no. Capital Y, enter. And if there's any more prompts like that along the way, just make sure you answer them correctly as well. And it takes a few minutes to install, but it does eventually get done when you see the 2 dones here. Let's just see. Let's test it. Let's see if it's working. The first command I can see if the service is running is system. Oop, let me get my mouse back in here. System, maybe? So let's see. If I want to see that the service is running, just to confirm, I can type system CTL, all one word, space, status, Unifi. So that's telling this, go to the system, give me the status of the Unifi service. Press enter. And in just a second, it spits out that you can see that the service is active and running. I can just press Control-C to exit out of that. And if I want to log out of my Unifi VM, I can just type in exit. And it's going to log out. You can see the connection was closed, and I can go ahead and close my shell. Now, for the moment of truth. Let's copy this public IP. Right here, the little, if you hover right over to it, you'll see a click to copy. So I'll click, and it tells me it's copied. Let's bring up a new window. https:// paste in the IP, and remember the browser communicates on 8443. Let's proceed. So it's not proceeding quite like I expected it, and I have experienced this before on a Unifi controller. Sometimes you just have to reboot the device. And after a good reboot, it comes up, and it seems to be working after that. So to reboot this device, I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. Go ahead and let it close that session. And they make it pretty easy to do that. You just come right up here, and you click the restart button. So I'm going to click restart, and then we'll pause it while we wait for the VM to come back up. Do you want to restart Unifi 2? Yes. And you can follow along right there. I'll pause it. Alright, so it does say that it successfully restarted the virtual machine. I am going to give it a couple more minutes just to come up and come alive. Let me go ahead and close the notification out. Let's hit refresh a couple times just to see if our public IP address changed. It doesn't look like it did at first. So let's give it just a couple more minutes to come alive. I'm going to pause it. Once I feel like it's good and done, we'll refresh it one more time just to see if the public IP changed, and then we'll go from there. Oh, see? That last refresh I did there, now it shows the machine is starting up. So if it's going to change, it's going to change in the next couple minutes. So I will pause it, and we'll come right back. Okay, so after a couple minutes, it looks like it came back alive. I'm going to do one last refresh. Everything looks good. Let's try this again. Let's copy this. https:// paste in the IP, of course append :8443, so we navigate to 8443 and press enter. Hey, look at that. You now have a Unifi controller up and running in the Azure cloud. Your devices could now be adopted over port 8080, and you are ready to go. For bonus points, if you have a public domain, you're going to want to ditch this red not secure, right? You're going to want to get a security certificate installed on this Unifi controller. So I'm going to put a link in the comments here to show you how to get the Let's Encrypt public certificate up and running on your Unifi controller for free. I think the only thing that I think is missing from that is probably a reboot. At the very end of that, you probably want to reboot your machine so that it comes alive. I mean, you can, of course, try it without the reboot and see what happens. I just kind of felt like it needed a reboot after that. So that's it. We created a virtual machine in Azure. We even used the SSH keys for the Linux portion of it, which you may be new to. We then installed a Unifi controller and got it publicly accessible, and you are up and running with infrastructure as a service in Azure. I really hope you had fun with doing this. Get out there and try it out.